Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's story. In this episode, we'll follow James as he travels abroad to take on new responsibilities with his father, while Diep stays behind and bravely oversees the construction of their future home. But an unexpected accident at the site puts both her and their unborn child at risk, testing the strength of their love across distance. James leaves his village with a heavy heart, flying abroad to work alongside his father. Though duty pulls him away, his love for Diep and their unborn child remains his greatest motivation. At home, Diep visits the construction site where James planned to build their future house, but she slips and falls, sparking fears for the baby. Rushed to the hospital, she learns it's only minor injuries. The child is safe. Relieved, she calls James, who panics and wants to return immediately. Diep steadies him, urging him to finish his work and come home soon. From afar, James throws himself into business, yet his thoughts never stray from her. Diep, meanwhile, watches the house slowly rise, each beam symbolizing hope. Across distance, their nightly calls weave dreams of family, love, and a promise to reunite in the home they're building together. Stay with us until the very end to discover how James and Diep find hope in their promises. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and help us reach our goal of 500 followers. Your support means the world to us. The morning air was thick with mist, softening the outlines of the village road as James stood quietly beside his mother. A large suitcase rested at his feet, its weight not only from clothes and belongings, but from the responsibility pressing on his shoulders. His hand clasped hers tightly, unwilling to let go. His voice, heavy with guilt, broke the silence. "Mom, I'm sorry for leaving you alone." His mother's lips curved into a faint smile, though her hand trembled as she brushed the hair from his forehead. "James, you must try hard," she said, her voice gentle but resolute. She could see the conflict in his eyes, but she wanted him to walk his path without hesitation. "Please take care of your health," James urged, his words tumbling out quickly, almost desperately. "Don't sit too long under the air conditioner. It'll dry your throat. And remember to eat on time." Each reminder was more than just concern. It was an invisible thread, tying him back to her, even as the car engine hummed in the distance. The early morning air carried faint rooster crows, punctuating the moment of parting. "Mom, it's hot these days. Take care," James continued, glancing once more at the small house behind her. Every corner of it held memories of his childhood, the laughter, the scoldings, the simple meals they once shared. His mother nodded, her eyes glistening with pride and sorrow. Before he could say more, a voice called from the waiting car. "James, it's time. You'll be late." He hugged her tightly, his arms clinging as if he could pour all his love and guilt into that single embrace. "Good luck, son," she whispered, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. James stepped into the car. Through the window, he caught a final glimpse of her, his mother's face fading into the mist, a silhouette etched in his heart. The car rumbled forward, carrying him away from everything familiar. Each passing mile widened the distance, but hardened his determination. He whispered silently to himself, "This sacrifice will be worth it. I will return stronger, For her, for Diep, for our child. The airport was alive with chaos. Luggage wheels rattled, voices overlapped, and loudspeakers announced flights in a rhythm that seemed to echo his own racing thoughts. James sat quietly in a corner of the waiting area, phone in hand, fingers trembling. "Diep, I'm sorry for leaving again," he typed, pausing as his throat tightened. He could imagine her gentle eyes reading the words, her smile forcing strength, even if her heart ached. Duty called. His father needed him overseas. The family business demanded his hands. He hated the timing, hated leaving Diep now when she was carrying their child. But it wasn't a choice. It was a necessity. The boarding call snapped him out of his thoughts. With each step toward the gate, he carried an unspoken vow. "I'll finish quickly. I'll return soon. I won't let her wait too long." The airport's cold light glinted across his face, highlighting the tension between hope and fear etched in his features. Meanwhile, in her small room, Diep sat by the window, pale moonlight washing over her face. Her phone glowed with James's message, his words heavy with both love and guilt. "I must go for family, for us," he had written. He promised to return soon. Diep's chest tightened, but she steadied her breath. "Take care of yourself," she replied, her fingers trembling yet determined. She vowed silently, no matter how long it took, she would wait. For him, for them. Her eyes landed on the framed photo of her and James. She reached out, tracing his smile with her fingertips. Outside, the night was silent, uncertain, but inside, her heart burned with unwavering strength. Love, she told herself, would outlast distance. Days later, the midday sun beat harshly over a dusty construction site. Workers bustled with beams and tools, the air filled with the buzz of saws and the shouts of laborers. Among them stood Diep, her white blouse already speckled with dust. She frowned at a stack of wooden beams. "Mr. Duyen," she called, her voice clear over the din. "I asked for 2.5 meters yesterday. Why are these shorter?" The foreman glanced at the beams, embarrassed. "There must have been a mistake. I'll check with the supplier." Diep nodded, determination flashing in her eyes. This wasn't just any building site. It was the land James had chosen, where he promised to build a home for her and their baby. Every detail mattered. Lynn, one of the workers, walked over and wiped his forehead. "Miss Diep, you don't need to be here in this heat. We'll handle everything." Diep shook her head. "I want to help. This house will belong to me and James, to our child. I need to be part of it." Lynn looked at her, impressed by her resolve. "All right. Then tomorrow, we'll begin the framework. You can join us if you wish." The saws whirred again, cutting into thick beams. Dust swirled through the air, clinging to Diep's clothes. She didn't care. She imagined the walls rising, the roof covering them, the laughter of a child echoing inside. Her heart swelled at the thought, but as she took a step toward the scattered planks, her foot slipped on loose gravel. The ground tilted beneath her, and in an instant, she fell. Gasps echoed around the site as workers rushed toward her. "Miss Diep, are you all right?" Her breath came short, panic flashing in her eyes, not for herself, but for the life within her. Pain shot through her knee. Her hands scraped raw against the ground. Strong arms lifted her quickly, carrying her toward the nearest truck. "We'll get you to the hospital," someone shouted. The journey was a blur, the world outside rushing past as fear clawed at her chest. She pressed a trembling hand to her belly, whispering silently to her unborn child, "Please, be safe." At the hospital, doctors examined her quickly. The sterile scent of disinfectant filled the air as she waited, her heart pounding with dread. Finally, a doctor returned, a kind smile on his face. "Don't worry. It's only light scratches," he reassured. "The baby is perfectly safe." Tears streamed down Diep's cheeks, a mix of relief and exhaustion. She thanked the doctor, her hands never leaving her stomach, as if to shield the precious life within. When she finally returned home that evening, she sat by the bed, phone in hand. With shaky fingers, she dialed James's number. He answered almost immediately, his voice filled with warmth and longing. "Diep? How are you? Is everything okay?" Her throat tightened, but she forced her voice steady. "James, I fell at the construction site today. They rushed me to the hospital." There was silence, then the sharp inhale of his breath. You fell? My God, Diep, are you hurt? Is the baby?" His voice cracked with fear. Diep closed her eyes, tears threatening again. "I'm all right. Just a few scratches. The doctor said the baby is safe." James's voice wavered, heavy with panic. "I can't stay here. I need to come back to you now." "No," she interrupted softly but firmly. "James, please don't. You have work to finish with your father. We'll be fine. Our baby is fine. Don't worry about us. Just do your best and come back soon." On the other end of the line, James's voice broke. "Diep, promise me you'll rest. Promise me you'll take care of yourself." "I promise," she whispered. He breathed deeply, steadying himself. "Then I'll work even harder. I'll come back as soon as I can. For you. For our child. I swear it." Diep smiled faintly, her free hand caressing her belly. "We'll be waiting." The following days stretched slowly, each hour dragging like a weight for both James and Diep. Thousands of miles away, James stood in a towering glass office, the view of a bustling foreign city spreading beneath him. The hum of traffic and the distant echo of horns were so different from the quiet fields of his village. His father's voice cut through his thoughts. "James, this company will one day be yours," his father said sternly, sliding a stack of documents across the table. "But you must learn quickly. Deals don't wait for emotions." James nodded, his jaw tight. He signed the papers, but his mind wasn't fully here. Each signature felt heavy, as if dragging him farther from Diep. He tried to mask the longing in his heart with professionalism. But every pause, every silent second between meetings was filled with her image. Her gentle smile, the way she whispered reassurance during their call. During lunch breaks, James would step out onto the balcony, phone in hand. He scrolled through old photos of Diep, each picture sparking a bittersweet ache. He typed messages quickly. "Are you resting enough? Did you eat? Don't go back to the site until you're fully healed." Her replies came like sunlight breaking through clouds. "I'm fine. I promise I'm resting. Don't worry about me. Focus on your work. We're waiting for you." James clung to those words. They were his lifeline. Back at home, Diep kept her promise. After the accident at the construction site, she avoided heavy tasks and allowed herself more time to rest. Yet her spirit wouldn't let her sit idle completely. She often visited the site, though carefully now, her steps measured, one hand always brushing protectively against her belly. The workers greeted her warmly. "Miss Diep, don't strain yourself," one of them said as she arrived with bottles of water for everyone. She smiled. "Don't worry. I'm just here to see the progress." Each day, the house took clearer shape, the foundation solidifying, wooden frames rising toward the sky. To others, it was just a building project, but to Diep, it was more. Each nail hammered, each brick laid felt like a promise from James, even in his absence. This house was a symbol of their future, of stability and love. Sometimes, as she sat watching the workers, she would press her palm to her stomach and whisper softly, "This is where we'll live. You, me, and your father. One day soon, we'll all be together under this roof." Nights were the hardest. The bed felt too wide, the silence too loud. She kept her phone by her side, waiting for the familiar vibration of James's call. And when it came, her heart always leapt. One evening, after another long day at the site, Diep answered to hear his tired but steady voice. "Diep, I'm here," she said softly, her exhaustion melting away the moment she heard him. "I just finished a 12-hour meeting," James sighed, his tone weary. "But all I could think about was you. Are you all right today? Did you eat enough?" Diep chuckled gently. "Yes, I ate. You don't need to worry so much. I'm resting, just like I promised." There was silence on his end, and she could imagine him closing his eyes, relief flooding through him. "I hate that I wasn't there when you fell. I hate that you had to go through that alone." Her voice softened. "James, you're not here in person, but I never feel alone. Every time you call, every time you send me a message, I feel you with me. And I know you're working hard. For us. That's more than enough." His throat tightened. "Diep, you're stronger than I deserve." "No," she whispered. "We're strong because we love each other. And because we're building this future together, even from a distance." Her words sank into him, soothing the storm of guilt that never left his chest. That night, after the call ended, James stayed awake longer than usual, staring out at the foreign skyline. In the midst of the glittering lights, he pictured the simple warmth of the house back home, the sound of his child's laughter one day filling its walls. Meanwhile, Diep lay awake too, her hands resting protectively on her belly. She whispered into the quiet night, "Your father will come back soon. Until then, we'll wait patiently. He loves you so much already." Days turned into weeks. James worked relentlessly, handling contracts, negotiating deals, and shadowing his father through every demanding hour. Yet no matter how busy he was, he never missed a call. The company colleagues noticed how quickly he adapted, his father proud, though he rarely expressed it aloud. But James knew his motivation wasn't business. It was Diep and the little life growing inside her. One late evening, after finalizing a major contract, James excused himself from the celebration dinner. His father raised an eyebrow. "You've done well. Why don't you stay and enjoy with the team?" James shook his head. "I need to call Diep." His father's stern expression softened slightly. Ah, the girl and the baby. For the first time, a smile touched his lips. "She must be proud of you." James swallowed the lump in his throat. I just want to go back soon. They're my real success. Back home, life moved steadily for Diep. The workers made swift progress, the house beginning to resemble the vision James had described. Neighbors stopped by, offering congratulations, some bringing fruits and meals to ensure Diep didn't overwork herself. She was touched by their kindness, but she knew the greatest comfort would only come when James returned. One afternoon, as she watched the roof beams being set in place, she took a deep breath and dialed James. When he answered, his voice was weary but full of warmth. "The roof is going up today," she told him, excitement in her tone. "You should see it. It's exactly as you wanted." He laughed softly, the sound tired but joyful. "I can picture it. And one day soon, I'll stand there with you." "You'd better," she teased gently. They lingered in conversation, weaving dreams of their life inside the new home. James spoke of painting the walls, of planting a small garden for Diep to tend. Diep described where the crib would go, where their child would take their first steps. Each word they shared built more than just a house. It built hope, resilience, and a shared vision that made the distance bearable. As the call ended, James's voice grew solemn. "Diep, promise me something." "What is it?" "Promise me you'll keep believing in us, no matter how hard it gets, no matter how long it takes for me to come back. Hold on to that." Diep's voice was steady, filled with quiet conviction. "James, I already promised. We're waiting for you, and we'll be right here when you return." His chest ached with both longing and gratitude. "Then I'll move mountains to come back as soon as I can." That night, as both lay in their separate worlds, their hearts beat in sync across the miles. James, surrounded by cold city lights, and Diep, embraced by the soft sounds of home, both held onto the same dream, that soon they would no longer need promises. They would live their future side by side in the house rising steadily from the ground, built on love, sacrifice, and the unshakable hope that carried them through distance and time.